Okay, you've heard everybody say podcasting is easy, but is it really easy? We'll look at that and much more in today's video, where we are going to talk about how to start a podcast in India, what are the recommended equipments, and some tips on getting started. Hello and welcome to the Podcasting University. This is Dilip, and in today's video, we are actually going to get started with some of the information that is required to start your podcast, and specifically from an Indian market perspective. Starting a podcast today isn't as difficult as it used to be about 3 years back. It is easier to get started and doesn't require a lot of investment. Today, podcasting has become one of the prominent channels for consumption of content. And there are a lot of people who are getting into podcasts. So if you have a good idea to get started, and if you know how to get started with your podcast, then it is just a matter of time before you become a podcaster. So in today's video, we'll talk about how to start a podcast in India. But then, is this information really specific to India? Not really, because the basics, the fundamentals, and pretty much everything stays the same with wherever it is that you want to start your podcast. But the only reason why we are picking India as a market is so that we know what are the options that are available from an Indian market perspective. In today's video, what we are going to cover is 5 things. Number 1, the equipments that you will need to get started. Number 2, the software that you will need and some basic knowledge about this software. Number 3, where to host your podcast hosting. Number 4, how to submit your podcast to the different directories. And number 5, some basic promotional techniques. So let's get started. Number 1, the basic podcast equipments that you will need to get started. I'm assuming that you've already picked a niche, you know what is the topic that you want to use for your podcast, you've identified your content plan, you're ready with all of those things. So if you are ready with all of those things, then what you need to know is how to get started with your equipments. So let's look at some of the basic equipments that are required. Number 1, microphones. Now, microphones can be of different types. There are primarily 2 different types of microphones. One is a dynamic microphone and the second one is a condenser microphone. Now, I don't want to get into a lot of the technical aspects of these microphones and confuse you, but one basic information that you need to keep in mind is that dynamic microphones capture less of the background noise and only captures the audio of the person talking into the microphone. Whereas the condenser microphones captures a lot of the background noise in addition to the audio of the person talking into the microphone. Condenser microphones might also need additional power to boost the amplitude or boost the audio. Dynamic microphones in most cases won't require that power. That power is called as phantom power. Dynamic microphones in most cases might not need that. So what is the best microphone to go with? Now, if you're doing a solo show, recording alone, or if you're doing an interview podcast, then the recommended microphone is a dynamic microphone, because all that you need to do is just speak directly into the microphone and it captures your audio. It reduces the background noise that the microphone captures. That way, editing becomes much more easier. But if you use a condenser microphone, the possibility of the microphone picking a lot of the background noise is very high, which means there is a lot of editing that will be required. Otherwise, you will have to record in a very quiet room, in a studio kind of a setup, which usually doesn't happen for podcasters like us. So the recommended microphone is a dynamic microphone. There are a lot of options that are available in the market today for dynamic microphones. I have written a blog post on the microphones that you can get for under 5,000 rupees. I link to that blog post in the description. You can check that out. And I'll also mention my recommended microphones in the description. So you can go and check out those microphones. Now, there are some other microphones which are condenser microphones, but which have some additional features like that of the Blue Yeti, which is slightly on the costlier side, but it gives you a combo of features that come in the dynamic microphones and the condenser microphones. Now, another important aspect that you might want to keep in mind is how you are connecting your microphone to your computer. Now, there are two different ways that you can connect it. You can either connect it directly using a USB input, or you can use a XLR input. Now, an XLR input will need an additional device which we call as the audio interface, which is an added investment. So if you can get a good dynamic microphone with a USB input, that is the recommended microphone that I would suggest that you go with. But if you are interested in going with an audio interface and you don't mind learning a little bit more of audio editing and doing some of these additional editing and mixing options, then I would recommend that you go with an audio mixer. Otherwise, the simplest setup is to go with a dynamic microphone that plugs directly into your computer using a USB cable. So that is what I would recommend. So when is it that you can use condenser microphones? You can use condenser microphone only if you're recording in a very quiet place in a studio-like setup. And what do you do if you are co-hosting, if you're hosting a show with two people? In that case, I would recommend that you go with a dynamic microphone, because that would help you reduce the audio that is captured from your co-host, and that way editing and mixing becomes much more easier. Now, the second equipment that you will need is an over-ear headphone. An over-ear headphone basically helps you monitor your audio. It will also help you listen to your guest when you're doing an interview podcast. And the benefit of using an over-ear headphone rather than using your computer's audio is that it will reduce the talkback or the echo that comes from the audio that your computer is giving out. Your microphone tends to capture that audio. So that is reduced if you use an over-ear headphone. So I would recommend using an over-the-ear headphone to monitor your audio. Number 3, a pop filter. A pop filter basically helps you reduce the plosives like the pa and the ba. While we are talking, we have a tendency of using these plosives a lot, and a pop filter helps you cut those plosives and gives you a little more cleaner and nicer audio. So a pop filter is recommended. Number 4 is a boom arm or a desk stand. Now, you would want something to hold your microphone. It is not recommended that you keep your microphone on your desk and record your podcast. So a desk stand or a boom arm helps holding your microphone. Now, you can always go with a desk stand which is a little economical in comparison to that of a boom arm, but these days boom arms also come for very low price. So I would recommend going for a boom arm. A boom arm looks something like this, which helps you hold the microphone. So this you can fix to your desk and you get a lot of control and flexibility in terms of handling your microphone. So I would recommend that you go with a boom arm. The fifth one that you would need is basically a shock mount. A shock mount helps reduce the noise that your microphone picks up because of accidental shocks. Now, once again, this is how a shock mount will look. There are different types of shock mounts that are available in the market, from extremely low priced to some high priced shock mounts. Go for a shock mount because it will help you reduce that unnecessary noise that your microphone picks up because of accidental shocks. Now, those are the 5 things that you would need as equipments to get started with your podcast. Now, here are some tips that I have for you when you're going and purchasing equipments for your podcasting journey. 1, don't be extravagant with your purchases. Go slow, buy equipments that are within your budget. Once you get started, you can always upgrade to better equipments once you know that podcasting is something that you would want to do for the long term. So I would recommend that you go slow, buy things that are affordable within your budget, and then get started. Number 2, pick a quiet place to record your audio, because that will help you reduce a lot of those unnecessary headaches and pain in getting your background noise edited out. So pick a quieter place from where you can record your episodes. Number 3, and the most important, before hitting the record button, ensure that you check your microphone settings and if your computer and your software is picking the right microphone. Otherwise, you will record your entire audio and then realize that your computer is probably picking the incorrect audio, or maybe your computer audio, and then you will have to do the entire thing again. So avoid that unnecessary rework. Ensure that you're always checking if your computer and your software is picking the right microphone. Now that we've seen some of the equipment, let us look at some of the software requirements. So there are three primary software requirements that I would recommend, but these days, you probably do not even need these softwares because most podcast hosts make it easy for people to get started with their podcasts. So they provide this online recording option and in fact an editing option as well. You can always use that to record your podcast and get started. Though that isn't something that I would recommend. I would recommend going with the conventional method, which is using a DAW, which is a digital audio workstation, which is another name for the software that records the audio and helps you edit the audio. So I would recommend going that route. Take the conventional method, use a software to record and edit your audio, and then distribute it to the world. So here are the three software that I recommend. One is Audacity. Now, Audacity is hands down the best software, best audio recording and editing software, and it is the simplest to use as well. It is free, you don't have to pay anything. It is compatible with both Windows and Mac, so you can just download it. I'll leave a link in the description box below. Just download it and you should be able to start recording your podcast. If you are using a Mac, then you can always go with Garageband, which is something that comes with a Mac, which is equally good as that of Audacity for both recording and editing. And the third software that I recommend is if you are running an interview format podcast. Now, people have a tendency to use Zoom to record interviews, but Zoom is not made for podcasters. While it is made for meetings, it isn't something that is recommended for podcasters. There are dedicated softwares that were developed for podcasters that can help you record interviews. I would recommend going with them unless you hate using something for free. And that software that I recommend is Zencaster. Zencaster gives you excellent quality audio for both you and your guests, and you get two separate tracks, so mixing and editing is easier with the audio that you get. In addition to that, Zencaster also gives you excellent quality video as well. But then in podcasting, why do you need a video? That is something that I'll come to in a little while. But for now, I would recommend going with Zencaster if you are recording interviews, because Zencaster has an amazing, very simple interface. It's very easy to get started and you get excellent audio. Now on to video. Why is it that you would need video if you're doing a podcast? YouTube is going big with podcasting. We don't know what their future plans are, but they are even planning to put together a dedicated podcast page. So why not get a video as well and get started with YouTube also to distribute your podcast? So by the time YouTube launches their dedicated podcast page, you already have a following on YouTube for your podcast and you can just capitalize on that. So record interviews on video as well. You can also use that for social media promotions as well. So use Zencaster, it will give you both video and excellent quality audio. So now you have the equipment, you have the software. Coming to the third aspect, where to host your podcast. So you will need a podcast host to upload your episode files and host your podcast. The podcast host will also give you an RSS feed. An RSS feed will look something like what you see on the screen below. This feed is something that you will need to distribute to podcast directories, because that's where you will get all of your listeners coming in. So if you don't have an RSS feed, your podcast cannot be distributed to the podcasting directories. So you will have to go with a good podcast host who can make available this RSS feed. In addition to that, there are a few other things that I recommend that you look for in a good podcast host. Like for example, reliable statistics. You would want a podcast host who can give you data that you can rely on, that is reliable. Number two, they can help you with distributing your podcast to the different directories. And number three, they should be able to help you with monetization. Now, there are a lot of podcast hosts out there which help you with either one or all of these. There are podcast hosts like Buzzsprout, Libsyn, Blueberry. All of them are excellent podcast hosts, but they are all premium hosts. So you will have to pay a premium monthly subscription to all of these hosts. If you want to get started for free, I would recommend getting started with Hubhopper in India. Hubhopper is by far the best free podcast hosting that is available in India. They distribute your podcast to a lot of directories as well, so that way you get that support also. And their interface is pretty easy and clean and nice, so you can always get started with Hubhopper. But I wouldn't recommend staying with a free platform for long, because free is after all free. I would recommend that you upgrade to a premium podcast host, because that way you will get a lot many other features that these free podcast hosting platforms won't offer you. And the podcast hosting platform that I use is Acast, and I would recommend Acast to you as well. With Acast, you can get started for free because they have a no limit, no barriers, free option where you can get started. And once you've got started and you know that you are in it for the longer term and you're serious about it, you can always upgrade to their premium option as well. They help you with monetization. They have a very simple interface. And the best part is that their statistics is IAB certified. So you know that what you're seeing is the right data, the right statistics. So I would recommend that you go with Acast. I'll leave a link to Acast in the description box below. You can always go and check them out there and get started for free if you don't want to pay and opt for a premium option. Now that you identified your podcast host and your podcast host has given you an RSS feed, it is time for you to go and distribute your podcast to the podcasting directories. But then, what are podcasting directories? And do you really need to go out there and distribute it to the podcasting directories? So podcasting directories are like aggregators. They aggregate all of the podcasts that are there on the internet and place it at one place for people to listen to it. So they also double up as a listening app, so people can pick any of these directories and listen to the podcast there. But they are primarily aggregators who aggregate and distribute the podcast to the listeners. So if you want listeners to discover your podcast needs to be on all of the prominent podcasting directories. And you will have to go about there and submit it to the podcasting directories. No, you actually don't have to do that, because these days, most podcast hosts help you with submitting your podcast to some of the prominent directories. And if they don't submit directly to these directories, they'll help you submit your podcast to those directories that they don't submit it to. Now, some of the prominent podcasting directories are Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Amazon Prime Music. I would recommend that you go and check if your podcast is there on at least these 5 directories, because this is where you're going to get most of your audience from. Ensure that your podcast is there on these directories, and if it is not there, then please go out there and submit it to these directories. Now comes the final part, which is getting your audience. Now that your podcast is there on these directories, there will be some amount of listeners that these directories will send to your podcast. But you still need to do the promotion on your own. And promotional strategy is something that might need an entire video, because it's a strategy in itself, which is something that I'll cover in another video. But for this video, I'll give you quick 3 tips to go about getting listeners for your podcast. 1, reach out to anyone and everyone that you know and send them the link to your podcast and ask them to listen to your show and give you a feedback. Number 2, announce the launch of your podcast on your social media channels to everybody that you know on your social media channels. Ask them to listen to your show and give you a feedback. Number 3, ensure that you're there on all the prominent social media channels, and every time you release an episode, ensure that you're promoting it hard on all of these social media channels. Your podcast, you will have to do the promotion. With all of that information, you're ready to get started with your podcast. You have a podcast and you can call yourself a podcaster now. In the next episode, I'll talk about a very simple editing technique. Now, editing is one of the most overwhelming aspects in podcasting, but I'll take that overwhelm out of podcasting for you, help you with a very simple editing technique that I follow, only the most essential editing that you will have to do with your audio, so that you can peacefully edit your audio and release your audio for the world to listen. Don't forget to tune into the episode the next week, where I'll show you this simple editing technique. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and press the bell notification so that you don't miss out when I release my new videos. Finally, we are on to the 3 tips that I spoke about a little while back. So in order to remove that unnecessary background noise, here are 3 things that I recommend. 1, record your podcast either late night or in the early mornings when there is the lowest noise. Late night, if you don't have a lot of those dogs barking in the background. Number 2, pick a room where there is a lot of furniture to record your audio. It will reduce the echo and make your audio much better to listen. Number 3, if your microphone still captures some of those background noise, then use a background music and use the auto duck feature on your audio editing software to reduce that background noise to a great extent. I'll show you how to use that in my next video. So don't forget to tune in the next week and watch my editing video. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification. That is all that I have for this week. I'll be back again the next week with another interesting podcasting related information. Until then, keep watching the Podcasting University.